began his work in oral history, community engagement, and storytelling by working with Chicago youths at Free Street Theater and the Chicago Freedom School. Since then, Francesco has worked as an oral historian and producer at NPR's StoryCorps and the National Public Housing Museum. Currently, he's obtaining an MA in History at the University of Illinois at Chicago and is applying to American Studies PhD programs for 2019. Prior to this, he received a BFA in Dramaturgy Criticism from DePaul University. Francesco's research interests include the history of post-war racial violence and white supremacy, cultural analysis, and memory and whiteness studies.
Cool. All right, so I'm going to share a little bit from a MA thesis I've been working on the past couple months. Here it goes. In the 1930s, a young Sicilian immigrant named Anthony Sorrentino emerged as a vibrant leader in the Italian-American community of Chicago's Near West Side, this neighborhood. Between 1930 and 1960, Sorrentino and two sociologists from the University of Chicago, Clifford Shaw and Henry McKay, articulated a new future for Chicago's oldest ethnic white slum, which hinged on self-help, indigenous leadership, which is their wording, and community control. Sorrentino founded the Near West Side Community Committee in 1938, which implemented juvenile delinquency prevention programs in the Near West Side, Camp Pompeii being one of its most prominent programs. Throughout those years, Sorrentino crafted an impactful ideology of whiteness and masculinity. This ideology proclaimed paternalism, self-help, and a sentiment of anti-state welfare as ideal qualities. Seizing upon small-town agrarian notions of community and masculinity, Sorrentino sought to transform young male delinquents into urban yeomen. So the purpose of studying these identity formations is an attempt to locate the ideological origins of post-war neo-populist conservatism, or what Richard Nixon famously proclaimed in 1968 as a silent majority, who espoused anti-blackness, anti-statism, disdain for taxes, privatization, and self-help. So historians of conservatives such as Eric Avila and Robert Self have provided seminal studies on this topic by studying the suburbs of the Sun Belt in LA, Oakland, and have studied the whites that live in these suburbs. However, these studies overlook the historical development of how this political identity, conservatism, varied throughout the United States. By studying Anthony Sorrentino's efforts in the Near West Side, I argue that ethnic whites in the urban Midwest incubated this conservative ideology and political identity through a different historical process than whites in the Sun Belt. So in order for young Italian ethnic white men like Sorrentino to cultivate this political and social identity, both ethnic male youths in the Near West Side and the public in Chicago needed to shift their perception of Italians as lesser or darker whites, which is coming from Matthew Fry Jacobson, to productive and ideal white citizens. And so for me, in order to do this, gender plays an important role. And this becomes central to my study in terms of how gender creates whiteness and this notion of proper citizenship at this time. And so, for many of these young men during this time, they're coming out of the settlement house movement, Whole House. The Great Depression is occurring. And so they're developing these anxieties over their inability to practice paternalism. And so additionally, for many of these ethnic Italian white men, many of which are third and fourth generation, the lingering memory of their lesser white immigrant ancestors and their reliance on state welfare and institutions such as the Whole House was an undesirable stain on their masculinity. Anxieties over losing control of their families and their communities, and embarrassment over their poor immigrant ancestors led young ethnic Italian white men in the Near West Side to craft a form of masculinity that would allow them to take back their family, community, and pride. And so this reproduction of masculinity, or this production of masculinity, relies heavily on the largest government intervention in U.S. history, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs. And so while these programs actually made ethnic white men grapple with feelings of powerlessness, they also provided the financial support for programs such as the Near West Side Community Committee, which is what Sorrentino creates. Ironically, these state and federally funded programs ultimately shaped the anti-statist ethos proclaimed by Anthony Sorrentino. So consequently, New Right ideology was articulated much earlier than some scholars have indicated. I argue that for some Italian ethnic whites in Chicago, calls for the rejection of state aid, privatization, and community control did not begin in their post-war white feudal suburbs. Rather, this political identity began to brew within our urban ethnic white slums. And so in order to track these formations, it's important to understand that Clifford Shaw and Henry McKay, two sociologists from the University of Chicago, played a huge role in influencing Anthony Sorrentino in the 30s. In 1929, Shaw and McKay, I'm going to quickly go through this, they publish a book called Delinquency Areas, which is a really impactful text that is cited in the 60s by President Lyndon B. Johnson when he's creating his war on poverty. It's a very important text. And so according to research findings, the highest concentration of delinquency was in areas that were typically surrounded by business and industry. And so a paradox concerning their theory is that while they acknowledge the role of business and industry to interrupt social cohesion and traditional norms, or what they call disorganization, they also believe that these conditions were natural outgrowths of urbanization. As a result, their conception of community improvement focused on internal conditions. And so, for me, it's important to note that these conclusions were heavily shaped by their rural childhood upbringings. And throughout the writing, they talk about where they come from and these perfect little rural towns that were really organized, and essentially how men had control of these communities. They talk a lot about that. So, for example, while describing his rural hometown of Luray, Indiana, Shaw argues that we may perhaps be able to build this kind of community in these little neighborhood areas, and in this way provide the kind of social situation in which all boys may grow up as normal and reasonably happy human beings. So this agrarian ideal would really underlay a lot of their theories, and Sorrentino would later seize upon it as he's creating his programs. And so Shaw Clifford Shaw actually goes to the Near West Side to meet with Anthony Sorrentino and other young boys in 1932, and they're still in high school at this time. At that time, Shaw had created an organization called the Chicago Area Project, which was funded by a state institution called the Institute for Juvenile Research that had actually received federal monies from, they received New Deal federal money later on. And so he meets with these boys, and it's pretty impactful. And Sorrentino recalls that Shaw's views were refreshing, since we Italians were then being stigmatized by the public and press. For some time, we had been hoping that we could do something to improve the reputation of the area. And so this meeting, like I said, was really influential, and these boys eventually, after graduating high school, would start an organization called the West Side Council, which is the first iterance of the Near West Side Community Committee. And they received direct financial support from the Chicago Area Project. They buy a home, they buy a building in a local park nearby, and offer 15 part-time paid positions. And so during this time, Sorrentino would increasingly begin to frame their community improvement project as a means to distance himself from what he says the long arm of centralized government. And so throughout the 1930s, as the nation was being gripped by the Great Depression, the image of the idle man was a major concern for officials and leaders. And so, reflecting this national anxiety, Sorrentino viewed that these ideal male street gangs of the Near West Side as the largest obstacle to improving the community. And he largely blamed the settlement house movement and government assistance for creating this weak form of masculinity that consisted of delinquency and idleness. And so, Sorrentino would articulate these critiques and ideals through a gender discourse. So consequently, he associated state welfare and any type of state aid as feminine and unproductive for improving the community. For example, when describing their first meeting with Shaw in 1932, Sorrentino explained that these people did not come to us in a spirit of philanthropy. They did not believe in handouts or lady bountiful approaches. Equating femininity with weakness and associating it with state welfare, Sorrentino defined successful community improvement as a masculine project. And he expressed the contours of this masculine project in a report from 1934. And he says, "Some of us sense the extreme difficulty and at times the fertility of obtaining better social and economic opportunities. What was the alternative? succumb to our misery, rely on relief on the WPA, have the long arm of centralized government solve our problems. Italian men needed a group and enterprise in which we could come together, pool our talents and resources, and take the lead in solving our community's problems. So as implied in this reflection, the success of this improvement hinged on a form of masculinity that was defined by self-help and a growing anti-state welfare sentiment. Anything else was considered feminine. It would not shape males into productive and ideal white citizens. And so eventually the West Side Committee would close operations in 1938. So they were around from 1932 to 1938 due to financial constraints. However, that same year in 38, the Chicago Area Project would once again supply funds for Sorrentino and some of the staff to recreate what is the Near West Side Community Committee. And so as the Near West Side Community Committee is being formed in 38, another affiliate of the Chicago Area Project in South Chicago, which was a predominantly Polish steel mill area, they had an organization that was also receiving money from the area project, and they were called the Polish Russell Square Community Council. And they had purchased land in Michigan City, Indiana, to create a youth camp that they called Camp Lang. And so inspired by these efforts, Sorrentino decided that the Near West Side would greatly benefit from this similar endeavor. And so a year later, the committee would decide to purchase land near Crete, Illinois, which is 35 miles west of the Near West Side. And so but before purchasing it, the committee consulted someone named Roy Alms, who was the director of camping for the Chicago Council of Boy Scouts of America. And Alms would be really influential in terms of how they would create these programs. And so they turned to him, borrowing many of the programs and tenets of a camp that he had developed earlier in the Chicagoland area called Camp Reinberg. And so in the 1946 handbook from Camp Reinberg, it states that the purpose of the camp was to provide young people the opportunity of becoming acquainted with the life of a rural community, with life on nearby farms, a very great opportunity to a city child. And so some of these programs that were recommended in this handbook consisted of caring for animals, bird hikes, nature printing, making nature trails, fishing, and building. And so Sorrentino's interest in this type of nature programming, along with Shaw's and McKay's, it stems from this progressive era notion that continues on into the New Deal era and actually post-war years, that urban blight would negatively impact the moral and physical character of an individual. This concern was captured in the 1945 report from the Near West Side Community Committee. This is what the report said. The camp, so they're explaining what the camp is. And so it's a country home for boys who come each summer from the dark, sprawling web of city streets to touch the flowers and take the sunshine in their hands. It's a happy valley retreat built, owned, and operated by the men of the Near West Side of Chicago, the grocer, the truck driver, the laborer, the lawyer, and the baker, with a faith in their ability to work together and help themselves. So just as Shaw and McKay sort of prescribed blighted areas like the Near West Side as unalterable, Sorrentino believed that the sprawling webs of these dark city streets would never completely be improved. However, the peripheries of Chicago, with lush forests and rugged terrain, could solve this predicament. So Sorrentino and the committee, I believe, are seizing upon an old trope in the American imaginary, that of the rugged rural yeoman, to instill the values of self-help. And so the rural landscape of Crete will allow these boys to become what I'm arguing are urban yeomen. And so with Alm's approval, the committee eventually purchased this land in 1941 and immediately began constructing this camp. And so Sorrentino recalls how when pictures and stories of this work appeared in the city newspaper, a great step was taken in redefining the role of these men, and most importantly, in giving them a sense of belonging to a group where no distinctions were made between offenders and law-abiding citizens. And so as he's suggesting, many newspaper articles were written throughout the 40s and 50s showcasing ethnic Italian male youths at Camp Pompey. And so many of these articles presented these youths as rugged yeomen who are crafting new identities in the rural landscapes outside of Chicago. For example, the Chicago Sunday Tribune featured an article during the construction of the camp entitled "Dead End Kids No Longer Own a Rural Estate." The article explained that for a long time, the 2,300 men or boys who lived in flats and multifamily houses between Canal Street, Ashland Avenue, Roosevelt, and Van Buren were supposed to be counterparts of this dead-end kids. They have no money, nor combs in their pockets. Today, these boys are owners of a 44-acre country estate. And so the article goes on to present these images of shirtless young Italian-American men hammering together wooden walls for cabins, digging ditches, and huddling together around architectural plans. Another article in the West Side Times from 1949, entitled New Frontier for Pioneer Spirits, quoted Chicago's mayor at that time, Martin Kennelly, describing the committee as people with a pioneering spirit and courage. And so this kind of language is reflecting this idea of sort of this agrarian notion of what citizenship should be. And so as the media is presenting ethnic Italian male youths as rugged yeomen and praising their self-help efforts, the committee also is seizing upon this narrative, and they're putting it out through their fundraising brochures. And so one of the brochures that they published presented young Italian boys shoveling snow, sweeping sidewalks, making fires in the woods, and playing on swing sets. And then in big bold letters on one side of the brochure read that the residents now assert a sense of pride in using their own talents and leadership and planning their own welfare. In another brochure published by the committee, it quotes young men reflecting upon this camp. And here's one quote it's from a 12-year-old boy named Frank Calabrese, explaining that this is better than regular camps because here we get to wash our own dishes. Other places, they got to wait on tables. That's sissy. Here, we guys wait on ourselves. We get to help clean the brush away from the front lawn too. And so underneath the quote, the author of this brochure explains that it isn't any real love of work that makes the small Italian boys who attend Pompey Camp enthusiastic over their chores. Out at camp, in a place of their own, they're able to see what can be accomplished by self-help. End of quote. And so by bragging about their ability to help themselves, these reflections expose the impact that the committee had on the consciousness of young Italian ethnic white men in the Near West Side. And so eventually, Camp Pompey and the committee would continue this work until 1968, but they would be forced to close due to financial constraints and also sort of the dwindling Italian-American population in this neighborhood. But nonetheless, this ideology of whiteness and manhood that Shaw, McKay, and Sorrentino formed between 1930 and 1960 forcefully remained throughout the next 2 decades via the rhetoric of neo-populist conservatism. And so for ethnic conservative whites, this bootstrap narrative concerning their poor immigrant ancestors, which really emerges as a central narrative in the ethnic white revival of the 60s and 70s, became a crucial foundation for explaining their disdain for government welfare, taxes, and the growing black and brown urban underclass. These narratives emphasize individual will rather than also including social political reasons for why their ancestors experienced mass class mobility and few legal discriminations in the early mid-20th century. By avoiding these realities of deep-seated social and economic inequities, conservatism among ethnic whites relies on this false narrative. Ultimately, by revealing the origins of ethnic white conservatism, I hope to challenge this bootstrap narrative by demanding more studies that reveal the complexities of each of our ethno-racial pasts. For Italian Americans, this is even more imperative as bootstrap ideology has robbed us of the possibility to see our past in its totality. We forget that it wasn't just our individual willpower that enabled our success as Italian Americans. At times, it was community power, as shown by the Near West Side Community Committee. And other times, it was also state power, as shown by the federal and state funds that the committee received, that enabled our ancestors to access privileges such as home ownership, better pay, or in the case of the Near West Side, an attempt to create a better community.